Hello and welcome to this episode of the Intersectionality Hub's interview with the famous and infamous Professor Sherene Razack, who has come and graced us here at Concordia with her very insightful and prescient analysis of the ways in which women's bodies get used and how murder factors into all of that. So interviewing Sherene is Jerry Smiley, another one of my favorite students, who is here and who is also a Trudeau scholar, who is going to interview Sherene about issues that demand to be heard.
So, Sherene, welcome to Montreal and welcome to Concordia. We're really grateful to have you here. I'm wondering, how is it that you came about looking at the issue of murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls?
Well, I don't think that's what I would have named what I was doing, because that was not a term that we used. I actually began really early in my career looking at violence against Indigenous and racialized women. I was trying to see what happened in courts of law whenever the issue was violence against Indigenous and racialized women, and that immediately led to both groups endured a lot of violence, but what was happening in the court was quite different for each group. So pursuing that line, it took me quite a while before I actually got to the murder of Pamela George, an Indigenous woman, and that's when I began very slowly to see that this was the major issue. In later years, that was more than 20 years ago, so in later years it would come to be known as the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, but it was not what I called it.
So I know recently you have changed locations, and I'm really interested to know what are some of the similarities and differences that you've noticed in terms of how Indigenous issues are talked about between Canada and the United States?
Well, I don't have extensive experience in the United States, so I'm very much always bringing a Canadian frame to the US context. But what has been happening in the US context is that people are coming to me and saying, what you wrote about the Canadian context applies exactly to what has happened in the US context and what is happening. So that's been interesting, and certainly one fact that is not very widely known is that police violence against Indigenous people is at a greater rate than police violence against Black people in the United States. In other words, it's pretty extensive. So that's one thing, but gendering that violence, that's always something that stays under wraps until you start talking to people, talking to women. So in that sense, I guess it's probably is the same.
Right. So tonight you're going to be talking about intersectionality, and I think that we hear that term used a lot, we see it thrown around a lot. What is it?
What is it to me?
Yeah.
I used to quarrel with the term. I spent a lot of time quarreling with the term because I didn't like the way that it seemed to lead to an analysis of how various systems come together. So, for example, you would look at patriarchy, you would look at white supremacy, you would look at class exploitation, and you would think about how are all those things operating in a woman's life. And intersectionality really was a theory and a politics, and is a theory and a politics that enables us to look at all of those systems. But in the beginning years, I was quite worried about the way in which the theory is not a person, so the theory doesn't lead us there. People kept trying to do all of these, think of all of these systems, but understand them as discrete systems. So you had white supremacy over here, and you had patriarchy over there, and you had capitalism over there, and you were trying to see how they were all operating. And that, from the beginning, was the difficulty for me. And I don't think I'm alone. A lot of other intersectionality theorists have this issue of trying to see how the systems actually operate through each other. And most of us loved Patricia Hill Collins' idea of the matrix. I used to sometimes tell my students in the early days, because they knew Star Trek then, present day students don't, but I would say it's like the Borg. It's like, all of these factors together, thinking and producing the same outcome.
I know that you have written a lot about inquiries and inquests, and I'm interested to know, we have the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada happening at the moment, and I'm wondering, do you think that there's anything useful that can come out of this process, and kind of how do you see intersectionality, functioning in this process?
Those are two big questions. Well, inquests and inquiries are not straightforward things. You don't, at the end of the day, you can't easily say that was a good outcome or not, because I think they are processes. And so over time, it might turn out to be a really great outcome because it will serve as a platform of education. People will see what went on and they'll begin to think about it, and counter narratives would circulate. And this may or may not have anything to do with what people intend. So its usefulness is something over time that you have to calculate. In terms of intersectionality, I think that the primary task of this inquiry is to look at what happens to Indigenous women. And I know there's been endless discussions around also looking at what happens to Indigenous men and boys, and you and I both have been on the opposing side of that. We think the focus should be on Indigenous women. I think the intersectional point here is when you have indigeneity and femaleness coming together, do you have to understand that with a different frame than you would if, for example, it were men? That's one thing to consider in this. And what is the difference that gender makes is the intersectional question that you would ask.
Right. And I think, up until this point, we haven't had the opportunity to have an inquiry specifically into Indigenous women's issues. So I think it sounds like there might be something positive that does eventually, perhaps, or sooner maybe rather than later, come out of this inquiry. And so thinking about the inquiry as a potential platform, perhaps, for counter-narratives to be built up. I'm wondering how in academia, how non-Indigenous scholars can work to create spaces for Indigenous scholars and professors and even community members to perhaps speak about these issues within academia.
It's a tough question to answer, because I'm not exactly sure if scholars should be doing that. I mean, other than a kind of general politics, which I hope everyone credible has, which is the politics of always making sure that trying to make sure that racialized scholars and Indigenous scholars are in the university, because at present they're not there in very great numbers. That's a kind of goal that to me is a little separate from trying to bring the voices of Indigenous communities into the university. The university is a dangerous place. I mean, I think these flows of information back and forth have to be treated with great skepticism, and we should sort of know where we are when we're producing knowledge about something. So it's my responsibility as a researcher to kind of determine what is the data I'm using, what is my subject position when I do it, what is, those are just normal research obligations. I don't think there's a special obligation. There's just a straightforward obligation of critically analyzing and self-reflecting on your knowledge production. It may or may not mean that you want to feature community voices in the university. I sometimes think that's a dangerous thing to do because I just see those things being co-opted really easily. So, it hasn't been at the top of my scholarly goals.
Right. So I really appreciate everything that we've talked about, and really looking forward to hearing more of what you have to say over the coming days. So thank you.
Thanks.